Good morning, everyone. How you doing? Hope you're having a lovely week. The weather hopefully slightly improving today. Welcome to our SDG 4 webinar on quality education. I'm Ram Dulab, Head of Environmental Sustainability at Middlesex. So before I dive in, just a bit of a brief background. Sustainable Development Goals are what I'd say a wish list of what the whole global planet's trying to work through. They replaced the the Millennium Development Goals back in 2015, and it's something that we're all trying to work to. So we as an education institution certainly are trying to contribute that through our international campuses as well, through our education. But just before I dive in, I just want to say a couple of house rules. Our panelists will have an opening statement and I will be answering questions. And if you do have a question, please put it through to the chat. And just remember, we are recording this session, so please be aware of that. But before I dive in and before I put an opening question to the panelists, I just want a reminder of what the SD4, I would say, is about. It's about, I would say, being inclusive, and trying to ensure inequality is there and trying to promote a lifelong learning opportunities. And when you think about going through the education system, it from primary school to secondary school to possibly university, this is what we're trying to work to. So without further ado, before I introduce my panelists, I will say this is that at Middlesex University, we've reintegrated the SDGs into our teaching curriculum. And that is quite essential. So that is obviously what we're trying to progress and work to those goals. But the first question I have to all the panelists as an opening statement is, what does quality education mean to you? Now, first question I'm going to ask is Tremaine Baker, who Middlesex recently received an outstanding in Ofsted. And as a former teacher, I know that's no mean achievement, but over to you, Tremaine.
Thanks, Rabin. Hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, so I come from, I'm coming at a lot of this from sort of a secondary initial teacher education perspective. So obviously, just to give everyone a bit of context, I lead the secondary education program here at Middlesex. So, but a lot of what I say is probably going to be pertinent to education. I do think, and obviously we're involved in training teachers, so we're thinking about how do we prepare teachers to go into schools to deliver quality education. So I think if I had to sort of boil it down to three things, I think for me, first of all, from an IT perspective, it's sort of connecting theory and practice. It's this understanding, teaching is a really complex process, getting students, trained to teach, ready to enter the classroom. And it is this sort of this foundation, lots of knowledge they're going to need, lots of theory they need to sort of engage with about, pedagogy and how to teach your subject and things. But on top of that, they're obviously developing the craft of being a teacher, the practice of being a teacher. So I think that's what it means for me in ITE. Firstly, how does that translate to sort of school-based training to schools and what that is in schools? I think it's the same thing. I think schools have a knowledge base, all subjects have a core knowledge base we want students to engage with, but it's the application of that knowledge. That's what's important. If I think about my own subject, history and geography, it's not just knowing facts about the world or knowing the past and names, events and dates, but it's the disciplinary processes of thinking causally or engaging with evidence that are really important, or the skills that students need. So I think it's that sort of mixture of all those things that's really important to quality education, not just knowledge, but it's knowledge plus, processes and skills. Secondly, I'd say what's quality education, particularly today, is about developing criticality. And in my trainees, we're always on about being critically reflective, you being able to improve and, develop yourself, being self-developmental. And it's the same in schools. We want our students to be independent. We don't want them to be reliant on us as teachers all the time, and we become the crutch for them. We want them to develop their skills, as you said, lifelong through to university, to be able to flourish themselves and learn themselves, continue to learn themselves, even when they're not getting formal education. And then lastly, again, that links in with sort of the last point, but sort of in our trainings, we talk about being critically reflective, being aware of yourself, being aware of what you need to do, what you need to improve. And it's the same thing for, in schools. We want our students to be critical and critically reflective, to take not a healthy skepticism of information, to be able to critically explore things, to be able to, I'll talk about this probably a little bit more later, I don't want to labor the point, but perhaps to deal with misinformation and the problems that we're going to probably talk about later on that are coming up, that our students are going into this world and having to deal with. So there you go. There's three things I think make a quality education.
And thank you for that introduction, Tremaine. And for me, what came out really clear was development is the key, and you really are putting the D into the SDGs, and I think that's essential of how we get our communities to develop. And thank you for that opening statement. Sandy, would you mind introducing yourself and having a pop out answering the opening question?
Yes, surely. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sandy Wolf. My background is actually in secondary education, and I also have quite a lot of experience in alternative education, PRUs. From my point of view, I actually feel very, very strongly about the quality of education that young people should actually be receiving. And I'm actually speaking from what, in my opinion, should actually be happening in schools. If you actually have a look at what the quality of education means to me, it actually means removing the barriers so that all students have a fair opportunity, so that they can actually focus on what they need to do to actually become citizens in the modern world. And what I'm talking about is, if you're looking at it from a school point of view, it's actually the needs of the students, curriculum, teaching methods, which Tremaine's actually highlighted, assessment to make sure that the students are actually on the right track, and if not, what needs to be put into place to get them on the right track. School culture, I think, is really, really important. Also, community engagement. Equality, for me, is also important. And also for students to actually thrive in a safe learning environment. What I mean by that is that they feel that it's safe, that they can actually offer their opinions. And through that, there are mechanisms such as school councils, which I will talk about later, if that's okay. Quality of teachers, as Tremaine was actually saying, is equally important. And also making sure that in a quality curriculum, that they also, our students also have the opportunity to look at what life skills are needed, particularly in this very, very changing world that we're actually living in at the moment. I think that from some points of view that not all students have actually got access to the curriculum. And this is where I might be rather controversial. And that is that schools have actually got to adhere to the external frameworks. For example, Ofsted, and there's been a lot in the newspapers about that recently. And looking at independent schools, you've also got the independent school standards, which have also got to be met. Putting that into a cauldron, it is like putting everything in and giving it a good stir and making sure that what you've got is a quality of education so that all children can succeed and they feel worthwhile. Because I think for some of our students, the feedback that they get can be quite negative. And I'm speaking from personal experience now when I was a child, and that can actually determine how they perceive their role within education. And for some students, particularly those youngsters in alternative provision, they're written off, and they shouldn't be, because they have actually got barriers to overcome. And that is why I think that alternative education for some students is the way forward.
Wow, that's quite an opening statement. So we had, just as a quick reflection, we had Tremaine talk about the importance of development, but I think you've highlighted quite a few issues there for me, is the barriers. That is ultimately, that came out really strongly, barriers for students to learn, to have a safety. But above all, what I feel is the learning environment. I think that is quite crucial. And hopefully we'll be discussing these as we go along. But all those things I think is quite important. And one of the things I'll say is that giving that students actually a voice, I think that's critical, essential, and I believe in it. And I try and practice what I preach. So over to Nagin, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Negin. I'm a master's student of environmental and sustainability, and thank you for having me here. So if I want to talk about the quality education, I think it means providing everyone with the opportunity to learn, no matter their background or their situation. I think it should be more focused on more than just going to school. It's about making sure that the students get the right knowledge and skills to succeed in life. It can be having a good teachers, learning useful subjects, and creating a safe and supportive environment where students can grow emotionally and also professionally. So I think quality education also teaches students how to think critically, solve problems, and keep learning throughout their lives.
I like that. That's a lot of good points there as well, and I think it is important to provide students with that safe platform and the opportunity to learn, and that's obviously coming out really clear, in these discussions. And this, I think, hopefully, everyone has taken aboard these points, and please put your questions in the chat. But I wanted to go back to you, Tremaine, and I wanted to ask you, in your role of Director of Programs for the PGCE, how do you ensure that future teachers are equipped to deliver the quality education, many of what's just been discussed, in our diverse and challenging environments? Because that's obviously one of what's sometimes obviously the crux of the issue.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, sorry, I wanted to segue because I think really helpful just listening to Sandy, some lovely ideas. I think that sort of echo with what we're trying to do with our trainees. So I want to sort of just build on a bit what Sandy said, revisit a little bit, as well as building on this question about how we, how do we ensure our trainees are really prepared for sort of a quality education in delivering that in a diverse and challenging environment. So I think Sandy said something, I think you're right. I talk about very often in teacher education, from the very start, we talk to our trainees about the three pillars of teaching. And then they're not in isolation, but, first of all, you've got everything that fits around planning, and teaching is more than just, going and delivering the teaching element. That's the second pillar. Whereas I think what sits behind that is a lot of what Sandy was talking about is, the ethical position students have, their assumptions about how students learn, their beliefs about, students and students' achievement. And all of those things are really important, so we want to shape our teachers with these positive views of the world and what students can achieve and what they should be doing, because that all of that fits into how they teach, and it's not just about teaching them tricks and how to deliver lessons, it's about those assumptions and what they think about how the world works will feed into how they teach their lessons. So teaching is then, the second sort of pillar, and giving them the craft to be able to deliver that. And then the sort of the third pillar Sandy mentioned is a really important one. I think she's right. It's about assessment, because I always say to my students, just because you taught it doesn't mean they've learned it, and learning is a complex, messy process, and it's you have to infer it. You have to try and dig into students' minds to get an idea. So I think that was really helpful for Sandy, talked about that. And I think other elements of that, as you said, Sandy, are about their beliefs, because there's a lot more to teaching than just delivering in the classroom. There's that whole pastoral role and making a well-rounded student. So I think that's something we try to give. And the other thing Sandy said that I sort of tie into as well is she talked a lot about curriculum, and from a student perspective, I think that's really vital. In schools, we want curriculums that students can see themselves in. Now, the hard thing is a hard balance, as we all know as teachers, is you've still got to teach them new stuff, they're not familiar with, they might not know about, because otherwise, they're not got the cultural capital, they're not, we're not enriching their educational experiences. But at the same time, we want to tie into, their interests and how they can see themselves in the curriculum. So I think, that's a big thing, I think, is thinking about school curriculums, and there's a lot being done at the minute. And I think that's what we're trying to get across to our trainees is what's being discussed at the minute. How do we effectively diversify our curriculum and decolonize it, and so that students can see themselves in that curriculum, and it means something to them. It's got a relevance, because that's going to help them want to learn. And as Sandy pointed to, that's going to give them an interest, give them something that they want to learn about. So that's something we really do try to achieve, is how do we get that across to our students. And from a practical point of view, then, just very quickly, I think for us, we're trying to really align centre-based training, what they hear at university, what they're taught about, the theory, how we're trying to develop their own perceptions of teaching and, widen and deepen their own schema about what pedagogies. We're trying to align that with what they experience in schools. When they go into schools, it's a combination of the two. It's them seeing the theory and, having these discussions with expert colleagues in schools and putting that into practice. So we spend an awful lot of time here really trying to sort of make sure that what they're learning at university, they're talking to their mentor about, they're observing in classroom settings, they're going to diverse school contexts as well. We've got a huge range of schools that are part of our partnership, so our students see the plethora and the diversity of the student body as well. We think about sequencing. That's really important for us in initial teacher education. And it's the same thing in the classroom. When do you introduce things to not overload students? We talk a lot in this stage. We're at the minute, September, as you said, weather's sort of on the turn a little bit, but we introduce them to the foundations of their subject, to the to planning. How do we plan a lesson? How do you manage classroom behavior? All those sort of foundational building blocks that actually, as they go in, by the end, we talk a lot about what we call an enhancing phase, where actually there's freedom, creativity for them to really be set individualized targets to really push themselves. But at the minute, we're sort of it's steps, it's progressive. And then, as I said, lastly, I suppose, what we're trying to do is just the content of what we include. Everything we want to include is trying to help them to understand the varied needs of their students, giving them an understanding of the sort of environmental issues that, they might come across and how you might teach environmental education, and sustainable, these introducing to the sustainable development goals themselves. So, yeah, it's a sort of a complex process, but I think it's sort of about building that over time and revisiting a lot of that, keep coming back to that so they're really well prepared when they go into their, I've got to not use acronyms, their early career teacher phase, and they're ready to sort of, to continue their learning in schools for that continuing 2 years, Robin.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to develop our pupils' judgments, because honestly, that is a really important thing for me throughout the education. So what we've had here is we had Tremaine talking about the importance of development in his opening statement. We had Sandy talking about the importance of working on barriers and providing a safe environment, and we had Nagin talking about the importance of opportunity. Now, for me, it's important that we understand what's happening in secondary schools, universities, but most importantly, primary schools as well, because this is where it all starts. And I want to bring in our next final panelist is Anastasia, because still teaching day, so she's given us some generous time. But the opening question I did ask the panelist, Anastasia, is what does quality education mean to you?
Good morning, everyone. Apologies for arriving late. So I think I missed a lot of what was said before, but I think some of the things have already been touched on. But I think for me, I think it's about teachers knowing their children and understanding them and being curious about their learners, because by doing that, you will then be able to adapt your delivery and what is on offer in order for all the children in your class to access the learning. I think that with the increase in SEND and the increase in children coming from a lot of different backgrounds and their story and history, I think it's really important that we are, as teachers in the classroom, we're really open to that, and we have like an understanding. I mean, you cannot adapt 5,000 different ways, but what you can do is you can make it accessible for all your children, so that they are included in the learning. And that's a really difficult thing to do. One, when you've just gone into teaching, and two, because there are, these kinds of fads that people kind of use in the classroom, but it is really about you being you and actually having that positive relationship with your class to enable you to adapt. And also, we always say in our school in particular, because every school is different, so like what works in our school doesn't necessarily work in a school down the road, because the demographics are different. There's all these different ingredients that make things different, but you've got to do what works for you And the same is like your neighbouring class, the children in that class might not respond to what is happening in your class. So that's why it's so important to really know your children, really know your learners.
And I think differentiation is a really key thing. And I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself as well. And actually, and I'd ask you to have a follow-up question in that, and you can do that as well. Because in terms of differentiation as well, and all the things that you've mentioned, I mean, what are the biggest challenges then you say in facing that quality of in delivering that quality of education? And how do you essentially address them? Because you have mentioned differentiation there. Are there any other tips as well?
Yeah, so as in, in education, buzzwords always change. So we don't refer to it as differentiation anymore because it's apparently, well, I agree with it because I come from the SEND world as well, because I'm a SENCO as well as a deputy and have been for some while. It means that somebody is different. It's not about being different. It's about everybody having access to what they rightly deserve. So the buzzword is adaptations. The challenges. I think it's a difficult one because adaptations mean various things. It could be through your questioning, it could be through the materials and the stimulus that you use to engage the learners. It could be through the activity or the task that you're asking them to do. And it could be things that the resources that you use, like in a maths lesson, you may use manipulatives, someone might not need manipulatives, but it's having all those things accessible, which in the SEND world is called ordinarily available. So everyone gets it, whether you have an additional need or not. And I really do think that sometimes, unfortunately, because of the demands of the classroom, and the level of need in your class. And sometimes we do have children with very high complex needs, which really is mainstream for them. That just makes the dynamics of the class a little bit tricky. I think people struggle with that. I think people struggle with having somebody who's pre-verbal to somebody who's not, and having that, adaptation. So I think it's about being well informed about different additional needs. And, and like I said, adapting as well as your resources in your mainstream school can go.
I think that's some brilliant observations, and thank you for that. And I think what's really important as well is to give people that opportunity. And I think one of the things I always encourage is promote a culture of kindness, and because the workload is often quite horrendous, let's face it, and kindness is quite important. And I wanted to bring Sandy in this because, reflecting on your extensive experience in both the mainstream and alternative education, what do you believe are the key components of the quality education system itself?
I think it actually goes back, excuse me, I think it actually goes back to, again, and I'm actually bringing it back into the school environment, is actually having a look at what's been touched on before, and that is the actual culture of the school. And I think that is really, really important, because depending on the culture of the school, it actually feeds into what both staff, students, parents, governors, board of trustees actually want from that school. And I've actually mentioned it before, and you've actually got the outside frameworks that you've actually got to work to, whether you like it or not. And that is Ofsted or independent, or the independent school standards, if you are an alternative provision independent school, and I'm currently working with a school who's actually in that category. I also think that if you're looking at it, and this is where sometimes the difficulty comes, and it's actually getting everybody in the school to think outside the box. Because you look at Ofsted and you've got this set of criteria that you've got to meet, you've got to tick it all off, hunky-dory. Well, no, it's not, because there are ways of actually meeting that. And I might actually sound offensive now, and I apologise. And that is that I think sometimes people in schools are scared to actually think outside the box, which comes back to what Anastasia was saying about looking at the clientele, the students that are in the school, and actually meeting their needs. And the way that quality education is, it is not just standing in front of the classroom, giving loads of facts, etc., etc., etc. It's actually getting the students involved in that discussion. Because as we know, youngsters learn differently. And for some people, yeah, they can actually listen in. For some people, it's visual. For some people, it's actually participation. And this is where I think, and what Tremaine's actually been saying about young people coming into education, it's actually having the courage to actually think about delivering information and lessons differently to accommodate all the young people who are actually in the classroom.
I think that's a brilliant response, because what you're talking about is innovation as well, because often there's pressure to sort of do standard approach, but where is that innovation? And especially when you look at the SDGs or trying to reach net zero, this is something that's not been done before. And you actually need innovation. You actually need to think outside the box, because it's clear if you carry on as you were, you're not going to achieve those goals. There's goals for a reason, and that's what we need to start promoting. And again, I want to bring you into this because you've heard a lot of educational practitioners speak about, obviously, you know, what it's like, the challenges. But for you as a student pursuing an MCE in sustainability and environmental management, how do you see the intersection between sustainability and education through all your time in education?
Yeah, I can see a deep and necessary connection between sustainability and education, because without an education population, it's very difficult to maintain and implement sustainability practices. So I think it's very important to start teaching sustainability from early ages. And also when it comes to university, I think it should be integrated to all the curriculum, not just in environmental sciences. For example, because I believe sustainability is not about teaching, it's about shaping minds. And for example, it's very important to, for example, for engineers, whether it's teaching engineers to design ecological, when they design, have some ecological principle in mind. And when it comes to businesses, for future leaders to consider both social and environmental issues and prioritize them. So I think I can see the deep and necessary connection between these two. And yeah, and it's very important to be integrated to all the fields, not just environmental sciences.
I think you've raised a series of valuable points here, and I think one of the points I'm going to latch onto and maybe bring Tremaine into this is the future, I guess, because Tremaine, I want you to ask you this question: is how do you see your role of teacher training evolving in the next 5 years or so to align better with principles of SDG for, you know, quality education?
Thanks, Rabin. And Negin, I think just probably building again, linking that into what Negin is saying, you know, there's some really good points from lots of people there, and a little bit of what Sandy was saying, because I think I'm a big believer in interdisciplinarity, you know, and interdisciplinary thinking, and what Negin said, you know, I think there's perhaps a temptation to think that the sustainable development goals and environmental education, climate change education, you know, fits under, you know, science, perhaps there's a little bit of geography, and you know that's how we cover it. Whereas actually, I think the shift, certainly going forward from me IT, but also in schools, needs to be that it needs to be a whole school approach. It needs to be a whole IT provision approach. It needs to be across subjects and disciplines that we're all thinking about notions of sort of teaching for climate change, sustainability, and environmental education. So I think that's the big thing, that the big shift that needs to come. And I think, you know, I think where we're very good, or where even students in my experience, you know, very good at, we often talk like with our geography trainees, you know, about the sort of 3 pillars of sustainability. You know, you're talking about, they're very good at sort of environmental and thinking about greening things, and you know, that's an easy one to understand. They sort of get economic, you know, but there's a bit more challenging. The one they probably do struggle with is this idea of, you know, social sustainability, you know, and issues of social justice. So again, I think that's something that will need to come through. For ITE, you know, we want to try and teach our students that, but I think it's also the same in schools, you know, that the challenges our students face in the future are going to come. They're going to need the skills to be able to meet those challenges. So how can we prepare trainees so that they're ready to go out into school to help students in school to deliver things like, I mean, I mentioned this before, like criticality. We want students to be able to handle, have a critical mindset, not to be a skeptic and fall down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, but to sort of have a healthy skepticism of the information they're reading, to be able to spot and identify misinformation. That's going to be vital for our kids, for both for their mental health, but also for their, for their own education, their learning, and for us as a democratic society, and what we, to manage the challenges that we face. Secondly, I suppose there's going to, how do we train teachers to, and I think this is where the humanities are really important, and as you said, Megan, it's not just the science, there are going to be huge questions in the future around conflict resolution, and resource management, and those are going to need the skills that humanities gives, the wider arts and humanities gives, in terms of being able to manage that, developing dialogue, handling sensitive, controversial, and emotive issues in the classroom. Those are the skills we want our trainees and our future teachers to have. And that for me is sort of where we want to go. And so I'll come again back to a point a bit. I like what Megan said about, it's about more than just teaching, it's that shaping of minds, and I agree, but also a bit of what Sandy said. And I think there's not a positive. I know we all can be critical of Ofsted, but Ofsted, work within their frameworks. But I think the problem at the minute comes back to what I said before, is we do have a top-down system at the minute. It is quite politically led, and we push towards a certain way. So my hope in the future years is actually that direction. I'm not a great believer in necessarily centralization, but I think this is something that needs to be done in terms of the requirement for curriculums to include climate change, sustainability education in schools, in IT provision, and for that to become part of the Ofsted framework. Because sadly, schools are, as Sandy said, that's the nature of the system we live in at the minute. So if we see this as important, we want to push forward to it, we've really got to get it into the Ofsted framework and make sure that schools have a requirement to deliver this to their students. So it comes back to what I said before, students are being critical, they're able to manage conflict resolution, they're able to manage all those challenges that are coming in the future.
I think that's a series of great points, and I think often when you're trying to work towards a shared goals, it's about taking people on that journey with you, and I think that's essential. Sometimes we forget that, we forget what is it we share goals, what is it we want to achieve. And I want to bring you into this, Andy. How have you successfully, or how have you managed successfully strategic change in schools to improve educational outcomes? Because often that is forgotten about for students, especially with students who may have different needs. How do you incorporate everyone on this journey?
I think, excuse me, there are several points here, and that is that I think that if you are appointed head teacher going into a school, for example, and you are going into an established school, then you have actually got to take into account where that school is at that point in time. Not only that, as a head teacher, you have actually got a vision, and that vision has actually got to meet what, say, for example, if you're in a multi-academy trust, for example, has actually got to meet the vision of that academy trust. I was quite lucky when I was a head teacher, because I actually went into the alternative provision, and I went into two schools from scratch. So it was a matter of me having my own vision, and my own vision was that every student who actually left my school would actually leave with a qualification. Now, that could have been GCSE, it could have been an AQA unit award, it could have been something like a coaching qualification, but they actually left with a qualification, and that was my vision. What then you've got to do is then to actually ensure that everybody buys into your vision, because if you don't, it's a non-starter. So that comes back to what I was actually saying originally, is where is the starting point? And as a head actually going in, you actually do an audit to actually find out where the school is at that point in time. And again, what changes actually need to be made. And I'm sorry to harp on about it again, but if you're actually going into a school or working with a school, as I am at the moment, they've actually had an Ofsted inspection, and so Ofsted have actually said what the school needs to improve on. So that is my focal point for actually working with the school of what it needs to improve on. And in order to do that, there are various ways, because you've got to get all the staff involved, you've got to get the staff to believe, and you've got to get the students to actually get on board as well. And in order to do that, you can actually go to goodness knows how many books that have actually been written, and there it is for you to actually say, right, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. But what you've actually then got to do is think, okay, what is right in order for that school to actually make progress, and how is that progress going to be monitored, and what evidence are you actually going to provide in order to show what progress has been made. And then if you come to practicalities, that is where your school improvement plan comes in.
That is brilliant. Sorry, if anyone wants to ask any questions, please put them into chat. Don't be shy. And one of the things an image I've got is that you've got to understand the school culture on one hand. Then on the other hand, you've got to achieve a vision. So Anastasia, can I bring you into this next question? So how do you balance the demands of curriculum standards and trying to change culture with need for fostering creativity and critical thinking in young students, which we've all sort of touched upon?
I think it goes back to this whole cultural capital thing, which has been, thrown around. And I think it's about, creating opportunities for children to be engaged in those ways. And I think, sadly, I think it can, because of where your school is and the demographics, you've all got to think creatively about how that can come, that can be. But it's about, it really is about, things like, I don't know, school councils or, joining up with other schools and creating debates. It's about getting speakers in, who are willing, and actually even past students, coming in to speak to children. So it's about, having those opportunities and where possible, having even cross-curricular links. But it's also it doesn't just start from Key Stage 2. You've got to think about it from the early years. So it's about giving children a voice and, teaching them to kind of, that they have got this voice and that, they can speak up. So it's about mapping out your curriculum so that there is opportunities for it to be built on as they go through the primary school. So that really every year they're like, year 1 ready, year 2 ready, year 3. And then by the time they get to year 6, they're like year 7 ready. And then you're kind of hopefully, putting people into secondary schools, which is a whole other ball game anyway, with a voice and some understanding, because going back to Ofsted, it's all about them knowing more, remembering more. That's another buzzword going around. So, it's just making sure that, and then going on to what was spoken about before about your school culture, it definitely is about everyone in your school being on the same page and wanting to be on this journey, and kind of investing and buying into what our school is about. Because if you've got that, then they're going to be kind of leading it across the school, which will help.
I think that's a great point. And you mentioned as well, trying to really use the resources that you have available to you. And I think that is essential and that's really important. I mean, I've obviously, just for record, I've worked in primary, secondary and universities. And I think reflection is important and you take that on. So again, I want to bring you into this as well, because I wanted to ask you, what are some of the key takeaways in your academic journey that you feel can contribute now to SDG 4?
One of the things that I've learned through my master's was that sustainability is not a standalone issue, but interconnected with many global systems. So I think it's very important when trying to implement new ideas or new sustainability practices, it's very important to collaborate with different perspectives, hear from different stakeholders. For example, even when it comes to university, when you want to just implement a new strategy, it's very important to collaborate with students, with different departments, and I believe is one of the most important things that I've learned. And I think sustainability and education shouldn't be confined in classroom. It should be in practical scheme as well. Even if it's projects, if it's events, internship and such like, because when you have an opportunity to get hands-on experience, you can grow and you can learn more.
Okay, brilliant, and I agree with you on that growing and learning. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, so which I can't see. Can we highlight what questions are, please, and or can those ask questions?
Yeah, hi, I can read out the questions for the panel. One is, would you think that being able to teach new things is dependent on or very much related to doing research? Or would you consider teaching to be independent of research and the other way around? Would anyone like to try and answer the question?
Yeah, I don't mind stuff. Thanks, Mina. I think I don't think you can separate the two, and I think that's the issue. I think there's perhaps a tendency to just, if we just go down the idea of, oh, okay, it's, we're just going to sort of go with our gut instincts, then actually we're undermining the importance of research. And I think this is I don't know, perhaps from an initial teacher education point of view, I think it's one of I think there's some positives to having a move towards school-based training, and that becoming emphasis. But I think we have lost some real important research hubs from a sort of subject pedagogical perspective. There's research has real value in as we said, classroom and learning is a messy process. It needs to be inferred, and teachers in their day-to-day practice really don't have the time to I don't think, all the necessarily, the research skills, the educational skills, the methodological abilities and the teaching methods to be able to engage with research that can help us as a teaching community. And I think so I think there's a need for the two. I think that, what and I hope it comes back again, but what universities used to give, was a really good base, particularly I'm just thinking from a secondary perspective, really good subject base, thinking about, how do students learn our subjects? What are our subject disciplines? That was really important, that those bases and that research is so important because it feeds into how we teach it. It comes back to what I said probably at the very beginning, that, the teaching part is just one of those pillars. And if we're not, engaging with research, if we're not, challenging our students' assumptions, then we're going to have some really bad teaching. So I think I don't think we can separate them, and I think you need to be a good pedagogue. You need to be engaging with research. You need to be research active. You need to be a critically informed research practitioner. We've just introduced a module for that, because it's a skill to be able to engage with research, and it isn't just taking it as it is. It's having a critical perspective on it. So I don't think it's as simple as saying one or other. I think that politicians answer in a way, but you need both.
I totally agree with you. And Sandy, I want to bring you to this next question. It asked by Humera. In relation to the school curriculum and the contents of UN SDGs and quality education, I would like to ask the panel how much teachers are equipped with knowledge about other parts of the world and feeling confident about discussing current affairs of the world. One example would be how we develop pupils' understanding of the fact of our chosen lifestyle in a huge contributing factor to climate change, and the poorest countries in the world would be the ones to be affected by results of flooding and as a result of global warming. So, Sandy, would you like to have a crack at that? And Tremaine, obviously, feel free to chip in as well.
Yeah, I think that what could happen, but again, from a school's point of view, it would be hard work, is to actually have a look, if you're looking at accreditation, of awards that a school can actually get. And if you actually investigate, there are a number of awards that are available to schools, which broadens up the whole of the curriculum. So, for example, you could actually have a look at doing work on environment and actually get a green award. That could filter all the way through a curriculum. And if it's possible, with schools, you could actually look at how plants are grown. You don't have to have an allotment. All you've got to do is to get some window boxes. And with students, you could do it through the school council. You could do it as a volunteer to actually get them involved in that kind of curriculum work, which again goes back to thinking outside the box. I also think that it's important that you also get outside people to come in and speak with the students about their experiences. And if you look at what's actually been going in this country, and you're talking about flooding, at the moment, flooding is actually on the news, particularly for the downpours that we've actually had. It might be useful to get people from the community to come in if they've actually had experience or they've got family experience that have actually gone through that flooding. Because from an emotional point of view, it must be devastating when you actually have the impact of what in fact has actually been going on in your life and how you've actually managed to cope with that. And again, it could be that some of the students may have had families who are in countries that have actually undergone flooding, for example, or they might be involved with families that have had famine. And again, we've got to be very, very careful here how that is approached. But again, students could be encouraged to actually talk about those experiences that perhaps they've heard from within a family environment. But again, taking it outside, schools could actually look at different awards that really broadens up the whole curriculum.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I taught in Malaysia for a couple of years, and we used to actually visit other schools as well, and we can learn about, natural disasters as well. Tremaine, as well, did you want to chip in as well, particularly in geography, where they offer globalization, and they cover that?
Yeah, I think just building on what Sandy said, exactly. I mean, I know like OCR. I think I've worked with OCR. They were sort of trying to get a validated GCSE on sustainability. I think there is this sort of move, which is good. Coming back to say that some of those impacts, as Sandy said, the impacts on those students. I think the other thing just to be aware of, I think, in the teaching profession is eco-anxiety. Is the worry that the future holds in our students. And yes, we want to teach it. We want to teach it in a way that is positive, that doesn't add. We've talked about mental health. It doesn't detract or make things hard in terms of the mental health and the eco-anxiety of our students. So I think another element. I know Sandy talked a lot about little actions you can do in school, within the student voice. But I think, as you said, subjects like geography, like citizenship, which actually sort of been pushed to one side over the years, are really important, I think, as well, to give students a sense of action of what can be done beyond the individual. That's what I think needs to be the focus within schools. I think we spend too long perhaps in schools making students feel guilty about the choices of plastic bottle use or not being green enough, whereas actually what citizenship does, and even geographical citizenship, is getting them to think a little bit more, how can the systems change and what can be done to sort of promote these changes, these sustainable changes, beyond just your individual lifestyle changes. What needs to be done in the future, because just little individual lifestyle changes aren't going to make the difference we need. We do need students to be aware of what they can do, how they can influence politics, how they can shape the future. And that's what citizenship does, the advocacy element. What can they do to sort of shape a better future? And I think that even being part of those sort of communities will help that eco-anxiety, that feeling that they can do things to prevent flooding, or to prevent some of these impacts that are happening in the future from getting worse.
I think that's a really great point as well. And Bridget did ask a question as well. Opening this to the panel is, my background is in research, and I would very much be interested in your view. Would you consider that research is a big part, and not such a big part, or to contributing to quality education, or is it more about practice? I definitely would say as well that data is essential in any practice that you're working for. We need more of it. We need to, I would always say, we need to share our data and we need to share practices, and that would really help. But open the panel to answer that question.
I don't want to dominate this, but I'll just quickly start, Rabin. Then, if others would want to add, I think I know just echo what I did say before. I think it's a combination of the two. We're interesting. I'm reading a really interesting book at the minute, which I can perhaps show people in a minute. I've just literally got it on my desk. But that does talk about the importance of research, and actually the problem, I suppose, coming back to the point that was being made, is research is difficult in education. It's a messy thing. It's that research communities are quite fragmented. There's not a lot of talking between psychologists and cognitive scientists and educationists, and and then on top of that you've got action researchers. In other words, teachers themselves engaging in research in their own school context, which I know, as Anastasia said, is really important because context is important. So how do we make sense of that? How do we get research communities talking together to try and find more generalizable rules that actually are helpful, and then once we've that's part of the picture, but also the other puzzle is how does that get shared with teachers? Teachers are hugely busy. They're time poor, in school. So again, how do we echo that, but it doesn't then get lost? I know Dylan William talked a lot about these ideas. Research sometimes get lost with these lethal mutations that it goes into the classroom and you just get these lethal versions of it. So again, I think researchers have a role to think about practice and what can that look like in practice, and how can practitioners use the research, because it's not just taking research. There's a way of using it. So I think, and I'd like to see a bit more money in research in terms of applied research. I think, it's also well and good having pure research and coming up with these theories in tightly controlled environments, but the complexity of teaching, we need more money perhaps available for applied research. And what does that look like in a school setting, and how does that, how's that going to be helpful for us? So a bit there. Sorry, I did pick up on that one again.
No, that's fine. My next question as well, when I think about the Bros song, "When Will I Be Famous?" Showing my age here, but I'm kind of adapting this question to Negin here, is when you think about your whole education experience, how do you think institutions can support students in becoming advocates for sustainability and quality education in their communities? Because we have all talked about it, but then you, Negin, from your experience from working, from being abroad to over here, how can we achieve that? You're on mute again.
Sorry. I think it's very important for example, for university or schools to encourage students to participate in leadership programs, if it's on campus or off campus. For example, not on of course, on a daily basis, maybe every month, every 2 or 3 months, we could have an event and ask the students to come and talk about their ideas and just participate in sustainability initiatives, and having some project that they can come and participate with different departments. I know, for example, for myself, I had the chance to collaborate and work with environmental team. So it was very important for me, and I've gained a lot of hands-on experience. If we can promote such things for other students, they can benefit from. And also, for example, I think it's very important to have some having some voice from the leadership. If university can ask some the leaders from different backgrounds, different industries, come and talk to students. They can learn from their skills, learn from their experience. So I think it's very important. And one more thing, I think if, for example, university can provide a platform for students to talk about their new ideas about the sustainability. So I think it's a win-win for both the students and university, because when it comes to university, they can just have some new ideas, and when it comes to students, they can grow their skills, and I think it's very important to have this connection between university and students.
That's a really great response, and it's going to lead into a final question to Sandy before I ask a final question to all the panelists. Sandy, can you share some insights in the role of self-evaluation and resource deployment in driving school improvement? Because essentially that's what obviously we would all like. So would you be able to share some quick insights?
Yeah, I think when it comes to self-evaluation, that is actually really important, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about managing strategic change. And through self-evaluation, you actually look at what actually needs to do to improve the quality of education for the young people. But also, I feel that everybody needs to be involved in that. So it is not just the staff, it is actually the parents, carers, the students, and the community, because the community is also important, because instead of actually the schools being self-sufficient and in a little hub, you need to actually have a look at what is going on with the community around you. Once you've actually done that, then again, it comes down to the school development plan and how you actually are going to sustain that. And then it comes down to cost. And we all know now that the restraints that schools have actually got when it comes to resources, this is where I feel that the community can actually be really, really involved in it. It happens quite a lot in primary schools, although you've actually got safeguarding, where you can get people from the community to actually come in and actually work with youngsters, say, for example, on reading, for example. And also, if the school is actually looking, for example, that they've actually thought about that when the students actually come in, they might need breakfast, to actually get in touch with local supermarkets, local community stores, and get the youngsters to actually go out and give it a good sales pitch. If they did that, and the students were actually doing business studies, you've got the link with the curriculum. And I think that that is equally important when it comes down to self-evaluation and looking what actually needs to change or develop within the school for the benefit of the youngsters in particular.
I think that's a brilliant response, and I feel our time's almost up, and I wish I did actually do the 2-hour webinar, because not covered what I really want to all the things we want to cover, but I think that's really essential, and I think it's really, we've discussed so many key points that we all need to do. But one of the questions I wanted to get one last question I want to ask all the panelists is, in just one sentence, what is one key action that everyone, educators, students, and policymakers can make today to support the achievements of SDG 4 quality education? So I'll go to you, Tremaine.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, I suppose for me, I think I've said this a lot. I think there needs to be a statutory requirement for teaching climate change and sustainability, environmental education in all educational settings and in all subjects. So I think that's key.
Absolutely. Sandy?
Thinking outside the box. I think that that is actually essential, and not being afraid to do it.
Negin?
I think for me, it's collaboration and integrating sustainability in all disciplines, not just environmental sciences. I think it's very important.
I think Anastasia may be off because obviously she's teaching at the moment, so we may get. I'll try and post a message in the chat. And I think for me, I think I do like all those suggestions. I think collaboration is important, but I think one of the key things I would say as well is kindness. I'm going to go back to that, because I think people have got to have mental capacity and a well-being, and to be supported and to be able to thrive in their environment. So I think kindness is essential. That's always going to be one to go to. Thank you for everyone for participating today. It is recorded as well, so please do share this with lots of people, and hopefully you realise that at Middlesex University we're working within the communities as well, and working as we saw with Anastasia at Bush Hill Primary School, and Stanley, who's worked in a number of schools, and I think that is quite essential to understand the community and really connect and network. Often, we talk about it, but we do it, and I think it's essential. And I say to everyone, please do that. So thank you for today, and have a great week and enjoy it. And let's try and work and continue to go on quality education. Have a great day.
Thanks, Rabin. Thanks everyone
Thank
for
you.
joining.
Thanks
Thank
ever so
you.
much.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye.
being together. Good luck, everyone. All the best. Bye.
Bye.